This is an essay by Joshua Hoffman, the founder of Future of Jewish.
Prices at the gas station jump overnight. Cable news fills with maps of the Middle East and images that quickly bring Iraq and Afghanistan to mind. Protesters gather in major American cities, some chanting against war, others more specific. This isn't America's fight, it's Israel's. Clips go viral. Pundits pile on. A familiar accusation hardens into consensus in certain corners of the public square. So, let's assume they're right. Let's assume that Israel, its prime minister, its government, AIPAC, and perhaps even the Jews more broadly, somehow maneuvered the United States into war with Iran. That is the charge, echoing across podcasts, opinion pages, and social media feeds. It's delivered with different accents, but strikingly similar conviction that America is not acting in its own interest, but as a pawn. You hear it when a prominent New York Times columnist warns that Israel's leadership is outplaying American politicians and the American Jewish community alike. You hear it when a populist commentator insists this is not America's fight, but one imposed from abroad. You hear it when a socialist senator frames U.S. policy as complicity in another nation's war. Different camps, same conclusion. America didn't choose this. Israel did. But this argument, for all its contemporary packaging, is anything but new. For centuries, variations of this claim have surfaced. The language changes. The targets shift. Yet the underlying idea remains remarkably consistent, that Jews, acting through influence or manipulation, pull the levers of power to serve their own ends. In the early 20th century, industrialists and isolationists blamed Jewish financiers for dragging nations into global war. On the eve of World War II, prominent voices warned that Jews were pushing America toward another catastrophic conflict. During the Cold War and into the Iraq era, critics recast the argument in more academic terms, pointing to so-called neoconservatives and their alleged dual loyalties as the hidden drivers of U.S. foreign policy. Today's accusations are simply the latest iteration, updated for the age of social media, but rooted in the same old suspicions. What is new, however, is the environment in which these claims are flourishing. In the aftermath of the war in Gaza, something shifted. The boundary that once separated criticism of Israel from hostility toward Jews has eroded significantly. As public discourse coarsened and historical memory faded, anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism, once at least nominally distinct, began to collapse into one another. Israel became not just a country to critique, but a symbol onto which broader animosities could be projected. Its leaders, its policies, and increasingly its very existence were recast in moral absolutes. And as that transformation took hold, so too did a subtle but powerful linguistic fusion. Israel, Netanyahu, Zionist, and Jew began to blur into a single, interchangeable villain. In that atmosphere, extraordinary claims found a ready audience. Casualty figures were accepted without scrutiny if they reinforced the narrative. Accusations once confined to the fringes, claims of uniquely evil intent, even of genocidal desire, moved closer to the mainstream. The result was not just criticism of a state, but a broader moral indictment of a people. The political consequences in the United States have been significant. Within parts of the Democratic Party, distancing from Israel has become a litmus test, complete with pledges to reject traditional pro-Israel support networks and reconsider long-standing security commitments. On the right, a different but equally potent strain has reemerged, one that frames foreign entanglements as betrayals of American sovereignty and casts Israel as an undue influence. Despite their ideological differences, both trends converge on a similar explanation for American involvement abroad, that it is driven not by national interest, but by external pressure, often coded and sometimes explicitly stated as Jewish. Public opinion has followed suit. Sympathy has shifted. Suspicion has grown. And in a moment of uncertainty, when wars are costly, goals are unclear, and outcomes are unpredictable. The temptation to locate a simple culprit becomes especially strong. So again, let's assume the premise is true. Let's assume Israel did drag the United States into war with Iran. Even then, a more fundamental question remains. Why was the United States so easily dragged? Great powers are not pulled into wars against their will by smaller allies. They act decisively and often forcefully when they perceive their own interests to be at stake. To suggest otherwise is to misunderstand how American foreign policy actually works. For more than 4 decades, Iran has been viewed in Washington not as a peripheral nuisance, but as a central strategic challenge. Across 6 administrations, Democratic and Republican alike, the consensus has been remarkably consistent. Iran's regional ambitions, its network of proxies, its attacks on shipping and energy infrastructure, and its nuclear program have all been treated as matters of direct concern to the United States. Presidents disagreed on tactics. Some favored diplomacy, others pressure, others a mix of both. But the underlying assessment did not change. Iran matters. Which brings us to the present. If the United States is now engaged in a direct confrontation with Iran, it is not because it was tricked into doing so. It is because, at some level, American leadership concluded that the risks of inaction had begun to outweigh the risks of action. That calculation may be right or wrong. It may prove wise or disastrous. But it is, unmistakably, an American calculation. And once we acknowledge that, the original accusation begins to unravel. Because if this war can be explained, at least in part, by American interests, then the claim that it exists solely because of Israeli manipulation becomes far less convincing. In fact, there are several reasons, cold, strategic, and entirely self-interested, why the United States might choose to confront Iran at this moment. Start with the question of global power. For the past decade, the international system has been drifting toward fragmentation. Rivals have tested boundaries, allies have questioned commitments. The perception, fair or not, has been that American deterrence is weakening. A decisive confrontation with Iran offers an opportunity to reverse that perception. It signals that the United States is still willing to use force to defend its interests, still capable of projecting power, and still prepared to shape outcomes in critical regions. In the language of geopolitics, it is about re-establishing credibility. Then, there is the matter of geography, specifically the Strait of Hormuz. This narrow passage is one of the most strategically vital choke points in the world. A significant portion of global energy flows through it, including a substantial share of the oil that fuels China. Over 50% of China's oil imports arrive via the Strait of Hormuz, accounting for roughly 40% of its total crude oil consumption. As the world's largest oil importer, China secures over 55% of its total imports from the Middle East, making this maritime route a critical energy artery. U.S. control over or even influence within the Strait of Hormuz provides leverage that extends far beyond the Middle East. In an era increasingly defined by competition with China, that leverage matters. If tensions were to escalate in East Asia, particularly around Taiwan, the ability to constrain China's energy supply would become a powerful strategic tool. Ensuring greater control over the Strait of Hormuz is not just about the present conflict. It is about positioning for potential future ones. Timing, too, is rarely accidental. The escalation with Iran has unfolded against the backdrop of delicate U.S.-China relations, including postponed high-level meetings between Presidents Donald Trump and Xi Jinping. Whether by design or coincidence, the conflict introduces a new variable into that relationship, one that complicates Beijing's calculations and potentially strengthens Washington's hand. And then there is a third, often overlooked dimension: signaling. For more than a decade, the Middle East has been quietly organizing itself into competing camps. On one side were countries like Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Egypt, and Jordan, states that prioritized stability and were gradually aligning themselves with the United States and increasingly with Israel. On the other side stood actors like Turkey and Qatar, advancing a different vision for the region, often in tension with that emerging alignment. The Abraham Accords seemed for a moment to settle the question. Normalization was expanding, cooperation was deepening. The region appeared to be coalescing around a pro-Western axis. But reality intervened. The 2019 Iranian strike on Saudi oil infrastructure, met with a muted American response, shook confidence in U.S. guarantees. The events of October 7th and thereafter made open alignment with Israel politically fraught in Saudi Arabia. During the months prior, it seemed like a matter of when, not if, the Saudis would join the Abraham Accords. By the time this war with Iran arrived, and the Iranian regime began attacking Saudi Arabia and other Arab countries, the Saudis were no longer hesitating. They had been forced to join the fight. War has a way of clarifying what diplomacy leaves ambiguous. It tests alliances not in statements, but in actions. It exposes which relationships are real and which are rhetorical. For years, Riyadh has attempted to balance, to hedge, to avoid choosing definitively between competing poles. But that strategy becomes harder to sustain in a moment of open conflict. And here is where American policy under President Donald Trump takes on added significance. By engaging directly in a confrontation with Iran, and doing so in close coordination with Israel, the United States is not only addressing an immediate threat, it is sending a message. The era of ambiguity is ending. Saudi Arabia, in effect, is being told that neutrality is no longer a stable position, that the region is reorganizing, that alignment with the right side will matter. If Riyadh moves closer to Israel and the United States, it could reshape the Middle East, consolidating a bloc defined by shared security interests and mutual defense. If it continues to straddle the divide, the region may remain fragmented, its conflicts prolonged by indecision. But that choice is not being made in a vacuum. It is being made under pressure, under fire, quite literally. Because in the Middle East, power is not measured by declarations. It is measured by the ability to protect. To deter is one thing, to defend is another. And so, the outcome of this war will reverberate far beyond Iran. If it ends with a clear demonstration of American and Israeli strength, the effect could be catalytic. States that have hesitated may begin to align. Partnerships that once seemed politically risky may become strategically necessary. If it ends inconclusively, if the signal is muddled, the opposite may occur. Doubt will persist. Hedging will continue. And the region will remain suspended between competing futures. This, then, is not just a war. It is a generational moment of decision. Which brings us back once more to the original claim, that Israel dragged the United States into war. It is a claim that simplifies a complex reality into a single cause. It offers clarity in a moment of confusion. It assigns blame in a way that feels emotionally satisfying. But it misses the larger truth. The United States is not merely reacting, it is shaping. It is not being pulled into history. It is attempting to direct it. The talking heads can debate whether America should, but they cannot seriously argue that it didn't choose to.